the promise of air, the promises of air, a promise of air, the promise of earth, the promises of earth, a promise of earth, the promise of fire, the promises of fire, a promise of fire, the promise of gem, the promises of gem, a promise of gem, the promise of ice, the promises of ice, a promise of ice, the promise of lightning, the promises of lightning, a promise of lightning, the promise of metal, the promises of metal, a promise of metal, the promise of thunder, the promises of thunder, a promise of thunder, the promise of water, the promises of water, a promise of water, the promise of wood, the promises of wood, a promise of wood, the promise of light, the promises of light, a promise of light, the promise of dark, the promises of dark, a promise of dark, the promise of anointing, the promises of anointing, a promise of anointing, the promise of unanointing, the promises of unanointing, a promise of unanointing, the promise of blessing, the promises of blessing, a promise of blessing, the promise of cursing, the promises of cursing, a promise of cursing, the promise of predestiny, the promises of predestiny, a promise of predestiny, the promise of destiny, the promises of destiny, a promise of destiny, the promise of faith, the promises of faith, a promise of faith, the promise of fear, the promises of fear, a promise of fear, the promise of archangels, the promises of archangels, a promise of archangels, the promise of archdemons, the promises of archdemons, a promise of archdemons,